All right, hey everyone. Today we're talking to Trey Lunot. His channel that you might know him better by is the Telos Bound YouTube channel, which focuses on Orthodox theology as well as some philosophy, generally speaking, and really trying to focus on how we can baptize philosophy through an explicit Orthodox lens. And he also has a new show that he's starting up. It's going to be a live show that he's starting called Babylon is Fallen, which you guys should all go and check out. So, Trey, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, thank you. I have been watching your videos for a few years, actually. Admittedly, not in the past probably year or so, but I was really happy that you reached out, and I'm excited to talk. I didn't know you were reading my book. I don't know. I feel like I've progressed a lot since I published that book. I definitely published it too early. Even the version you're reading is probably the second edition, which is even like edited to be better than the horrible first edition, frankly, just because I didn't know how to write. I was like 15 or 16. But anyways, I'm honored that you read it, and I'm pretty excited to talk about these topics that you mentioned before we started recording, because it's kind of like the bread and butter here at Telos Bound. We just finished the communal ontology sort of introduction live stream show. It was great because we could go for like 3 hours almost just talking about all these different ideas. But yeah, no, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, this is actually the second time that I'm reading it. I actually read it I want to say back in like May of 2023, and I was really interested by
Oh,
it. And then I just recently reread it this past week or so. And so the book, as we should mention, I don't think we said the name, but the book is called Aphesis, and you published that back in like what, 2020, 2019? It was a couple years ago, wasn't it?
well, the first one was in 2021, and then really quickly I rewrote it almost completely, and published that in 2022. So yeah, it's been a year and a half now since the second edition.
Awesome, and people can find that on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
We'll put a link in the description. People can go check that out and buy the book. It's a really great book. It's really fun read as well. It's not doesn't get too boring or anything like that.
No,
But
thank you.
yeah, no problem. But Trey, the reason I had you on was because I want to talk about the book that we just mentioned, Aphesis, and really in that book, I think the main thing that you're critiquing is one of what you might say is one of the kind of foundations or the bedrocks of Western philosophy, especially in the past, 500, 600 years or so, even before that, arguably, which has at its basis this idea of a specific type of subject, a subject that is sort of self-starting, or it tries to ground itself on a sort of A equals A logic. And you see this in a lot of philosophers. I mean, arguably Descartes, or and then as well as you see a different version of this with like people like a Fichte in Germany a little bit later, where he tries to ground this sort of like individual that's just sort of this pure individual, and he's able to ground himself without anybody else. There's no God in the picture. It's just the individual who grounds
Mhm.
himself, the sort of A equals A or I equals I, just pure ego. So Trey, can you talk a little bit about this subject that you're critiquing in your book?
Sure. Yeah. I didn't really understand just how sort of universal these ideas were, because I just read Zizek. So all the stuff I read about in Aphesis or Thesis, I think you actually have the correct pronunciation. I call it Aphesis, but it they all stem from Zizek. So I'm sort of getting a very uh, very uniquely distilled down form of German idealism, which is Zizek's sort of unorthodox Lacanian interpretation of Hegel, reading it through Lacan and Freud, and through postmodernism even. And yeah, so Zizek is actually like he knows all of Western philosophy. Todd McGowan, who's someone I've interviewed on my channel, he's kind of a student of Zizek's a little bit. He said that Zizek is like one of the most well-read persons he's ever met. But still, he has sort of a very specific way of presenting what the subject is, and it's really based in this understanding of negativity and of privation and of withdrawal and of the ontology of the subject being one of a fundamental incompletion. And this is sort of what I didn't even understand in Aphesis. Like if you read the Drive ontology chapter, which in my opinion is kind of just a rehashed version of object-oriented ontology by Graham Harman. And no offense to him, but it's not like good metaphysics at all. It just immediately runs into a bunch of problems.
I believe,
and that's sort
just
of
real
the
quick, I
first
believe that
chapter of the book.
Dugan referred to, Alexander Dugan, who I've covered a lot on this channel, referred to object-oriented ontology as something like the philosophy of the devil himself, or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know if I would go that far, but maybe it's just because I've met Harmon himself, and he's not exactly a demoniac, but yeah, I mean the like the worldview that it sort of presents. Like if you take, I mean, any sort of erroneous worldview, if you took Neoplatonism to its logical conclusion, I mean, being united with the one means I lose my identity, I lose all my relations with my family. It's sort of like a hellish image of the eschatological state of the world. In any case, Zizek's subject is sort of like, the way I see it now, like, I didn't even really touch, I guess I touch on this in the preface, but really only now looking back can I really see that Zizek was actually getting at something true about the quote-unquote ontology of hell, of sin, of evil itself. Now, I said quote-unquote ontology because there is no ontology of evil. Seraphim Hamilton has this term reverse apatheticism, and he says that this is sort of how we have to understand sin and hell as sort of the fullest realization of sin. It's you can only understand it in negative terms because it's almost less than nothing. So we could say hell is the privation of the good, the privation of humility, whatever. That's what sin is. It's and evil is the privation of the good. So that understanding of evil that you see in the Christian tradition is essentially what you get with Zizek's subject. But as you mentioned, it ties back to like even Fichte himself. I think really I'll just mention this last point and then stop because throwing out a lot of ideas. But I think Fichte's idea of self-positing is kind of crucial here because Fichte kind of conceptually, I don't think it's ultimately really a coherent notion, but he tries to articulate a being, a creature, or a finite creature that is able to create ex nihilo. And that is what the self-positing subject is. And the claim of Fichte is that it's not, obviously we don't have magic powers to create objects. Like that's not even Fichte's idealism. It's not that the subject constructs a world for itself. That's sort of a vulgarized popular form of it. It's more so that the subject itself, the I, is this groundless self-positing act that the very act is synonymous with the essence, with what it is. It's so all it is sort of pure subsistence in this self-positing mode. And this idea, I do think it has parallels in the Fathers, but not in the same way, because this is not the way the Fathers articulated the ontology of hypostasis, of personhood. They actually, if you read Maximus and other people, even Augustine and stuff, the closest parallels is, I sort of already mentioned this, is when they're describing sin and hell. I always use this example from Maximus. He says that those who live this life in accordance with the passions, they will be tormented for infinite duration because they created a mode of being for themselves which did not in fact exist. So it's like this mode of being, so it has some form of existence, yet at the same time it doesn't in fact exist. Well, this is what Zizek literally says in his chapter on Fichte. He says this is the self-positing, the pure appearance, where the nothing sort of takes on a virtual reality of its own that only subsists insofar as it basically thinks it does. Now, this is ultimately, it's not a communal ontology or a communal understanding of the subject, and we can get into that probably, but I'll just leave that and see what you have to say.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, especially in the context of some of more, I guess, like modern philosophers who are kind of, critiquing the West and critiquing liberalism, like post-liberals, etc., when they say that the individual is a sort of invented, it's something that was invented. That's really hard for a lot of people who have just grown up in America, grown up in the West. It's really hard for them to imagine the subject almost as anything other than the individual. So when these people who have, studied the philosophical tradition, and they know that the individual, I'm pretty sure you can find this in other places in ancient philosophy, here and there sprouting up, but it really takes hold on a societal level, starting with broadly speaking, the modern era, wherever you want to pinpoint that at, where you have this notion of the individual with this sort of going away from a more communal ontology of various sorts. Even, I guess, the pagans kind of had a communal ontology of various sorts, but not necessarily as we Christians would have it. But nonetheless, they understood that you are more than just an individual. But this is what we mean when we say that the subject of the individual was an invention of the modern Enlightenment age, broadly speaking. So I find that really interesting. But then going to your book, you have three main critiques of this subject, of this sort of A equals A logic. And the first one, it's about how self-knowledge, there's a sort of impossibility to have self-knowledge within the system. I guess to use a sort of Marxist or even like Hegelian term, you sort of do this in your book, you do this eminent dialectical critique of this Fichtean-esque subject, which I believe you call the drive ontology, showing how, assuming all of their premises, assuming everything they say is true, how it kind of folds in on itself, which I really like how you do in your book, because you don't have to rely off anything, other presuppositions, other sort of philosophical traditions or theological traditions. You're just able to sort of destroy this notion within itself. So the first sort of wave of attack that you do is the idea of how self-knowledge is impossible under this system. So could you explain a little bit about this critique?
Sure. Yeah. So I think first you just have to think of what a subject is. I don't really know if there is a definition. The fathers will say that the person ultimately is an apophatic category. We can only know the person insofar as they reveal themselves to us in their energies. So actually, language actually testifies to this, because you have the subject, like I, in a sentence, and then if you want to say anything about the I, other than just repeating I, you have to appeal to something other, which is a predicate. So, and then there's a copula, and this is sort of Bulgakov's stuff, Sergei Bulgakov, very brilliant Russian Silver Age theologian. But so the first impossibility of subjectivity is based in the fact that the person, or the subject, however we want to understand it, has this perspective, has this experience of both itself to a certain extent and of the world. That is kind of just what the subject is. But at the same time, whenever the subject tries to reflect upon its own self and just grasp itself and know I, whenever the I tries to have this purely self-referential movement, it ultimately fails. So that really is the first impossibility of subjectivity. And an analogy, a way to think about it is just as impossible for the subject within this conception to know itself as it is for an eyeball to somehow see itself. This self-reverting movement cannot occur because the very point, the perspective from which the experience cannot be included within the experience. It is the sort of it is the point within or outside of the picture. And this sort of gets into Žižekian stuff, because Žižek, he has this thing where it's both inside and out to a certain extent. This is Lacanian as well. But in any case, the subject within this ontology, remember, Orthodox, we can look back and see, we just avoid all these problems with a correct understanding of personhood, which is ultimately revealed in our in Christ, in our Christology. But yeah, so that's the first impossibility of subjectivity. It's that within a purely self-referential understanding, as you're saying, like sort of the modern individual, in that conception of subjectivity, you can't have true self-knowledge at the fundamental level of actually knowing yourself, like experiencing yourself as you truly are, because as John Paul Sartre says, when you try to do this reflection, as soon as you grasp any content, as soon as you say, even name yourself, or say something about yourself, or in your head think you've grasped yourself. As soon as you do anything like that, a new self is created as the new point, the new perspective from which this object, this content of experience, can be perceived. So, so yeah, that's the first
So
impossibility.
I guess another way to put it is that in order to for you to like view yourself, you kind of have to view yourself from outside of yourself. But if there's only the self, then there's no way to
Right.
really do that.
Right.
And so,
Exactly.
and so when you delve
yeah,
into this at the kind of base epistemological level, all you have is this sort of just like pure positive axiom. Well, I know myself because I know myself, and there's no real reason why
right.
there's the case for that to be the case.
Right. Yeah, exactly. At some point, it just gets to this groundless self-positing, just this pure self-assertion. And this is in Zizek's categories. This is the death drive. This is sort of this the Hegelian night of the world. This core abyss at the core within the human being. This impulse to continuously self-negate, but a self-negation that, insofar as you can say that is a self-negation, it has this virtual self-posited sort of being. And I know a lot of people may like listen to this and be like, oh, this is nuts, this is just crazy, like continental philosophy. But if you think about the privation understanding of evil, think about that ontologically and think of its ontological implication. It means that there is, to a certain extent, it means that non-being can persist in the world. At least, I mean, you can say until the eschaton. Evil, the stain of nothingness, it can be present, and even though it's nothing, it's nonetheless a stain. I think I may have even put that in the preface of Aphesis. But yeah, like that's sort of the point. It's like, and that's what Jean-Paul Sartre says. I don't know if you've read Being and Nothingness, where his point is basically you kind of get to this point unless you want an infinite regression, which is absurd. You just need a pre-reflective cogito. You just need this pure sort of pure consciousness, pure subjectivity, basically. Not exactly the terms he would use, but yeah, but precisely for him, it is pre-reflective, so you cannot actually reflect upon it. It stands outside of experience, outside of your horizon of reflection.
And I like what Nietzsche, and I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil, he has this part where he's more or less, he doesn't say it explicitly, I don't think, but he's more or less critiquing the Descartes' cogito and how other people use it. And he says, even when you say, I think, therefore I am, there's so many presuppositions that are baked within that people don't realize, such as identity over time, or the fact that language has meaning, or the fact that the ego that the ego actually does exist, that you haven't proved. And it doesn't seem that these people who sort of propound this theory of this specific version of the subject, they don't even try to go the sort of Kantian route, really, of making a sort of transcendental critique where they say this has to be true due to the impossibility of the contrary. It's just when you, as you been saying here, when you keep digging, you realize at some point there's just this raw assertion that the subject exists just like this because, well, we say it is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and in Pavel Florensky's Pillar and Ground of the Truth, he sort of explains how, like, if you're being faithful to the pursuit of truth, you can't just stop here. Once you realize it, you got to be like, okay, I got to go somewhere. And you can, theoretically, as he shows in the Pillar and Ground of the Truth, sort of even notionally, in a Hegelian sense, you can move further into this sort of skeptical, self-referential, because doubt is ultimately self-referential skepticism. It is doubting, like that's what Descartes does. He realizes that you can doubt everything else except for the self, or that this is the most primordial, fundamental truth. Yeah, like it. I mean, he does make arguments for like innate ideas that are ultimately just as necessary as the cogito. So it is more complex with Descartes, and people have sort of let me know about that. But in any case, the fundamental idea of attempting through doubt, through this process of saying, well, if I cannot know you for 100% certainty by one sole criteria, which is myself, which is the same self-certainty that I, for some reason, which is ultimately ungrounded, I assume that I have. That's what sort of motivates epistemological sort of skepticism. This attempt to find a epistemology and for rationality to discover the truth of being just purely by its own terms. But the point is that human rationality is finite and created, and the truth, the logi of human beings, is not within us by nature, it's within God, who creates us on the basis of our logi to be further united fully through participation in his inner life, be transformed into his eternal ideas for what we should be, which is, in its essence, to be fully united with him. So this conception of the subject that you get in German idealism and that ultimately leads down to Zizek is literally the logical outworkings of the reversal of this conception of the person that you ultimately see dogmatized in Nicaea, and I think holds sort of for at least nearly a millennia in both East and West. And then you sort of have this gradual splitting away of the West, and then you have, especially sort of, I would say, I know it's sort of a meme at this point, but there is truth to it, that nominalism and sort of other and voluntarism and other sort of theological and philosophical metaphysical developments in Europe at the time transformed, sort of provided the basis and undermined certain essential aspects of the gospel. Like nominalism is incompatible with a Chalcedonian Christology. It just is. So if you sort of have nominalism sort of seep through your entire culture, you're going to lose a true understanding of what Christ did when he became incarnate and when he was crucified and resurrected. And that's precisely what you see with the Protestant Reformation. That's sort of the main error of the Protestant reformers. But yeah, so there is a history to this subject. But for me, Zizek, and even the subject I sort of present in the beginnings, or for most of Aphesis until the Christian section, is sort of the logical outworking of this self-referential subject who is turning towards itself instead of turning towards God ecstatically in love, in communion with God. And the problem revealed by the first impossibility of subjectivity is the paradox that it is precisely through this self-referential movement that we fail to know ourselves. It's only when we transcend ourselves, when the sixth day moves into the seventh day, where God sits in Sabbath rest in the heavens, gazing upon creation, saying, this is good. It's when we enter into this transcendent perspective as creatures. This is what theosis is. This is how we overcome the impossibilities, or the first impossibility, but I'd say all three of subjectivity.
So let's move on to the second impossibility that you outline, which is
Sure.
With regards to intersubjectivity. And here it seems like what you're critiquing is the idea that with this notion of this sort of modern subject, this kind of individualistic subject, you cannot ever get a true recognition of the equality of another subject. You can just sort of see them as a sort of semi-subject, or like somewhat of a subject, or somewhat as an object, and you create what you call this, or maybe you're getting this from somewhere. I'd be interested to learn. You get this perspectival hierarchy that's created. So could you talk about that?
Right. So the idea is based on an idea that Zizek, he talks about. Other people have sort of formulated it in different ways, and not just in the context of subjectivity, but since sort of idealism and the philosophy of subjectivity is sort of niche, only a certain number of people got to this paradox, which for Zizek is the way he would articulate it, is that if you are absolute, if I am the center of reality, it's just an ontological almost fact that another person who considers themselves, and are truly, we sort of know, I mean, even Zizek has a basic sort of faith, an empirical, a faith in the empirical world that there are actually other persons in existence. I think that faith is ultimately ungrounded for Zizek completely, but he doesn't even concern himself with true epistemology in a way that I think you have to if you're going to sort of take all the ontological insights from Kant and these other people. The epistemological problems come with it, but he doesn't seem to affirm this. He sort of just takes it as he uses this empirical facts that we know, that there are other persons in the world, just a mundane fact, and he sort of parses this out to have this subject that can be, as we sort of described, this absolute self-referential singularity, the center of its world, yet nonetheless others can appear to it. And for Zizek, he never gave a term to it, which is why I did. I didn't. Maybe at the time I liked to create new terms. I certainly don't anymore. But the church, the theological tradition of the church, has all the terms you sort of need, all the terminology. But he didn't. He would say like a mediation, or he would say that it's a scandal. That's a term he loved to say. He would just have like a paragraph and then move on to something else where he just hits us with, oh yeah, just knowing other people, by the way, it's an ontological scandal. So you can't actually know anyone, and all your relationships are kind of false in the end when we get down to that. And now I'm going to talk about movies. That's kind of how Zizek writes. So he'll hit you with these sort of existentially terrifying ontological theories, and then go on to some silly stuff. But yeah, so the second impossibility of subjectivity just logically outflows from sort of the first impossibility, but sort of the cause of both is the self-referential conception of the subject, whether it be this behemoth sort of false Hegelian concept. It's a misunderstanding of Hegel, but as this like absolute totality where the subject consumes the mind, consumes all of reality. Even if you want to understand the totality like that, or if you want to understand the self-referential quote-unquote totality in the Zizekian sense of some negativity, the fact that the primordial ontology of the subject within these conceptions is one of self-reference ultimately gets you to the problem of just the fact that a self-referential movement is the opposite of communing with the other, of moving to the other. So if the core of your identity is withdrawing from the other to actually know the other, which almost for Zizek this would be an encounter with the real, the true core of another person, which is ultimately, I think, impossible even for a Lacanian. I don't even know. I'm kind of just sort of I don't know what I'm talking about in that respect. But the key point is that with another person, just the fact that they're as absolute, as singular, is a radical scandal. It's an ontological scandal, because how can there be two universalities? How can there be two centers to the world? And then if you have another person, how can there be three centers to the world? Well, the answer to that is the doctrine of the Trinity, specifically the notion of perichoresis, of mutual interiority, of the Father the Father finding himself in the Son through the Spirit. And you have a unity in distinction. And a great example of this, which both shows unity in distinction and the sort of properly understood hierarchy that exists within the Trinity, is a river and a river source. The river source is the cause of the river, and in a sense is interior to the river. Where do you make the strict distinction between river and the river source? Who really knows? They both define each other. And the river source obviously causes the river, but at the same time, you cannot speak of a river source without a river. So you sort of have this situation, an analogy to the Father and the Son, where the Father is the cause of the Son and the Spirit, but nonetheless, this very causation that is natural to him, and it is his personal property, is what defines him as who he is. So I didn't explain that as well as someone like Father Demetrius Staniloy does in the Holy Trinity, the structure of supreme love. And I know we sort of said we don't want to get lost in all the Orthodox stuff, but I'll just point people to that, because that when I read The Experience of God by Father Staniloy, that's when I was able to conceptualize these things and properly articulate them and understand that, the paradoxes that Zizek comes to, the fact that ultimately the ontology reduces to nothing at all, where your subject becomes a positivization of nothing. Well, it's because being is communion, because being is ultimately the unity, the communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which we are invited to participate in. it through the experience of God.
So, deep down, we all know that there are truly other people. And when you look in, the German idealist tradition, people like,
Right.
Fichte
Okay.
and Schiller, you see that they have to do a lot of philosophical coping to deal with the fact that
Yep.
the center of the universe is this self-referential of like I am myself, this sort of strong foundationalism, this raw positing of the ego, of their own ego, which is the center of the universe. But so when it comes to viewing other people, though, because they're not the center of your universe, you're almost unable to fully make them human because they are not you.
Right.
There's this
Right.
sort of othering that has to go on, or this sort of dehumanizing that has to go on. So could you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah. So that, I guess, is another way of explaining this perspectival hierarchy. I don't really use that terminology anymore because I almost just see it as pride, like it's just sin. But it's sin almost at the ontological level, which I don't think is false to sort of affirm. Even when you read about mystical experiences, specifically in the Orthodox, like Hesychast tradition, the experience, the subjectivity they will describe is so radically transformed through this experience of God that I don't see it as sort of not having. I don't just see this as philosophical sort of ramblings. I think that the ontological stuff has meaning in terms of our actual understanding of Christian spirituality. But that's sort of a different topic. Well, not really, because I think that this lessering of the other that I think fallen subjectivity sort of does almost in its very, that I almost see it as part of original sin. It's just sort of the burden of being withdrawn to a certain extent from the other. Now, if the other cannot be fully revealed to you in their absoluteness, and I think like it's not ultimately the reason has to do with this inner pride in us. This is why we need to be purified and saved. But if they can't appear to you as in the fullness of their personhood, because that fullness would compromise your own, which is how fallen subjectivity experiences itself. It wants to be withdrawn. It does not want communion with the other, or it wants communion with the other on its own terms, which is false communion, and ultimately will break apart. It will not last into the end. This is just what you get. It's a logical outworking of the understanding of a self-referential subject. And I mean, Zizek is very consistent because it's not just that the subject dehumanizes others. Zizek will argue that really at its core, the subject itself is this inhuman void, this pure negativity of withdrawal, this monstrous entity of the death drive, which is, as opposed to Fichte's sort of like positing of the self with content, Zizek is sort of this empty, and I think more truthful to the notion of self-relation, an empty form of this subject. And I think Zizek, he actually, in terms of an analogy I really like to use is the Ouroboros, the symbol of the snake eating its own tail. Zizek's subject, or Fichte's subject, would be like the Ouroboros as we traditionally understand it. But Zizek's subject would be the Ouroboros that has consumed all of its body. And all that remains is this gaping mouth of unfulfilled desire. And this is Zizek's void. This is the death drive, this continual movement that is ultimately a failure. It is the failure, but nonetheless, the very failure is what is posited virtually in the world. Like that is what subjectivity is, this pure appearance in the mode of a failure of the subject. Like I can kind of quote it off the top of my head. In Less Than Nothing, he says the subject attempts to represent itself, it fails, and the subject is the very result of the failure of its representation. So the failure, insofar, again, as we're saying, the subject failed to self-relate. That you're speaking of something with being to a certain extent. But for Zizek, it's purely virtual, pure appearance. Now, I just want to make clear, this is what Zizek says, and it's absurd, and it's not a true ontology, because fundamentally, it's an ontology of sin. The only reason why it seems to have a sort of intelligibility to it is because it is a reversal of what is eternally intelligible in God, which is communion, triunity. It is a reversal of a communal understanding of subjectivity, so it's a reversal of the truth. And that's why I link Zizek with Gehenna, with his subject with hell itself.
So I think this really segues us into the third critique that you have. You kind of talked about how for Zizek the subject is like the Ouroboros, but it's kind of eating itself, and all that's left is its sort of mouth and sort of dealing with all the kind of contradictions that lie there.
Yeah.
So your final big critique that you make of the subject in your book is that you talk about how there's really no way to reach a final or an absolute state because of how time works, and how the subject, I think you kind of said it earlier, there's this inherent constant negation within it, where in each moment as they go by, and I'll let you kind of elaborate further and correct me here, but as each moment goes by, the subject kind of others itself from itself, and therefore has to constantly be negating itself.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, that is a paradox that ultimately it cannot be fully realized, even in the way I described it, because if you truly believe that the I was fracturing itself at literally every single point in time, and by the way, what is a point in time? You run into Zeno's paradox, where you can divide it infinitesimally, and that's because it's a false image. We're already dealing with bad abstractions here. We're working within a self-referential system of ideas that we need to step out of ultimately, but now that we're sort of in there, we can sort of show how it's ultimately incoherent, which is the fact that, yeah, if the subject, in order to have a self-referential understanding of the subject, it can only latch on to one specific point in time. This is what Pavel Florensky says. He sort of demonstrates this in The Pillar and Crown of the Truth, because what self-referential activity is movement away from the other. This is how the German idealists, for the most part, define subjectivity. It is this negative self-relation that is, as Fichte says, the act, or the sort of being which is identical with its act. So we have that idea there. Now, the thing with this search for the absolute, it's called the third impossibility of subjectivity, the impossibility of absolute knowing, is that we're searching for sort of an ending to the subject, to not an ending, but where it finally discovers itself and stops dividing itself throughout time. But again, as I was sort of saying, and I sort of lost my train of thought there, but I was trying to say that the subject gets the subject understood with the pure present, with this pure self-divided or self-negating now, moving throughout time, always negating itself, informing itself throughout time, which, as I was trying to say, this is what you get with a self-referential conception of the subject. Ultimately, I think this is incoherent. There's no principle for identity over time here, so I don't even think you can explain your empirical experience, even if you say this is at the level of form. I think even Kant makes a pretty decent argument that no, there has to be a sense in which the I doesn't change over time. So I don't think you can ground it in a pure present, because this pure self-negating present, for one, is not actually something that exists. It's a bad abstraction. This is why St. Augustine, in the Confessions, I think he was sort of, through no fault of his own, he was trying to understand time, at least initially, within a self-relating ontology. And he got to a point where he's like, well, the past was, so it is nothing. The future is not yet, so it's nothing. And the present is this infinitesimally small thing, so it's basically nothing too. So I just got nothing. Well, the reason why you got nothing is because you're trying to understand the communal world in a self-relational way, which is not how it is. So it's just a misunderstanding there, sort of in terms of your epistemology, your method of approaching the mystery of being and of subjectivity itself. So the way I would see it more now is that there is still a connection between this notion of a purely self-referential subject and this pure atomized present, pure now, and that is the temporality of hell. If you read Father Dimitris Staniloy's essay Eternity and Time, he describes hell as this, the opposite of the eternity of communion. Rather, it is the withdrawal into the self. And if time, for Staniloy, it is the measurement of this going out, the person going out of themselves towards the other ecstatically in love, this meeting of the self and the other in the third, in God, or in other people, in directed, when even two friends, sort of C.S. Lewis makes this point, two friends, their friendship is based in something beyond them that both unites them. Like two friends who may play soccer are, they, or anything really, any activity, their friendship is united in this third element there. In any case, I was sort of getting off track there. But the third impossibility of subjectivity, it does stem from this understanding of the self-referential subject that is ultimately sort of correlative to the self-referential understanding of the present, which is the temporality of hell. Instead of there being any time as the measurement of going out of yourself, hell is pure withdrawal into the self. So no going out of yourself, while God, the three divine persons, have always moved to each other and already reached each other. So there is no interval or distance in the love of the Trinity. And this constitutes the eternity of God, according to Father Staniloy. So that sort of self-negating now is that present moment, which is an odd eternity because there is no time there. So it's like a false eternity. The almost the beast image, to use the language of Revelation, of form of eternity.
So while in heaven,
yeah.
So while in heaven there is, because there is, constant love, with God and constant communion with God, we can say is the fulfillment of time. Whereas for hell, since there is no love there whatsoever, it is the complete negation of time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and this has led to, like, not understanding this is the basis of a lot of popular misunderstandings of the eternity of hell. It's not an eternity that's symmetrical to heaven, and it's an eternity without content. We don't actually know what it's like. That's something also people don't really know, or think about, I guess, or take note of, is the fact that hell itself actualized as like the lake of fire has not occurred yet. That occurs in the eschaton. So even if you want to appeal to sort of supernatural experiences or whatever, people, like, there are people who are tormented now. We sort of know this from the tradition of the church and the testimony of Scripture. People, if they have, or at least we know that in principle, people who rebel against God, they experience His presence, which is what we are brought into after death. They experience that negatively just by virtue of the case. It's not that God is like mean in this respect. It's just sort of the ontological truth here, which has a spiritual dimension to it that can't be reduced to ontology. But yeah, so that's the eternity of heaven, and we are brought into this eternal. We are brought into the life of the triunity by grace through being adopted as sons in Jesus Christ. So it is through union with God that we enter into eternity. And there are, like, saints like Saint Sophrony will describe this sort of timeless experience. It is beyond time, as the fulfillment of time, because our life in time is our sojourning towards God, ultimately. And because He is ultimately the final destiny of all. He is the end of all, whether we like it or not. And our sort of personal will determines whether we're going to like that, our final fate, or if we're going to rebel against it. When we are united with God in Christ, we enter into eternity, because now that movement of journeying ultimately to God, but also to other people, but we receive all of creation in Christ too. So when we're united with God, there is no more distance. The distance has been overcome, in the sense of there is no more alienation, and we're face to face with Christ. And this is when we have united with the object of our desire, and that is eternity for us. Now, obviously, I would affirm sort of the Cappadocian and patristic understanding of a sort of dynamic ever-moving rest understanding of this, and this is because God is infinite. So actually, I think that the third impossibility is subjectivity, the fact that we can't just grasp ourselves and know ourselves finally for what we are, is unique, because I think it's the only one out of all the impossibilities that I don't think will ever be overcome, because they aren't meant to be overcome. So, or it is not meant to be overcome, because we're not meant to just stop developing. We are meant to always actualize our infinite potential for communion with God, which implies, yes, a rest, because there's nothing, we're not lacking anything, but there's always some more nonetheless. That's sort of the antinomy of the ever-moving rest, the fruitfulness, the bountifulness of God, which we as finite creatures can eternally participate in.
And is this
so
Yes, I just want to ask: if this third critique that you have is at all influenced by, from what I understand, is Zizek's, very unique, shall we say, understanding of Hegel's absolute, the sort of final moment, the dialectic, where the dialectic is not, in this view, it's not actually the sort of positive self-grounding, but rather it's the realization that it, at some level, it is impossible. And there's some peace that's made with that. Is that influenced at all by? Is there any connection with that?
Yeah, for sure. It's basically the same thing, I would say. The only thing is that Zizek wants to go the route of saying that, then if the absolute is just this end point of the dialectic, to the point, like, for him, it's just like the death drive. That's where dialectics can't get at. That's the real for Zizek. And it's ultimately the subject, I mean, to put it really simply. And that it's not what Hegel himself believed, I would say. And then absolute knowing for Zizek, at least in Less Than Nothing, is basically just this, like, conscious philosophical registration of the fact that of our own finitude and of the impossibility of reconciling with ourselves just by the ontology of the... So it's like the weirdest form of spirituality or like possible ethics that Zizek would put forth, because he is not at all really he does not offer advice, at least outside of political affairs at this level. He doesn't give spiritual guru advice, but in terms of absolute knowing, it's like a really weird, it's just a weird, like, very clearly came from the mind of someone who only cares about philosophy and rationality and stuff. And I know that is what Zizek is like. So it is not being released from the alienation, the inner contradiction, the antagonism at the heart of subjectivity. It's just recognizing that you never will overcome it and sort of being at peace with that. But I sort of try to parse out a critique and aphesis of why I think that even by Zizekian standards, this is false. Because for Zizek, he has this whole thing that you cannot just passively recognize a truth of a contradiction or something wrong. There's sort of a implication that this is false ultimately. Not even that you should try to solve the wrong. That's not... Zizek isn't a moralist in that sense. He really is a secular thinker. But there at least is a claim that for Zizek, that simply recognizing a false reality or something wrong, like, I'm trying to think of an example. My favorite example is the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Like, everyone recognized that it was such a big scandal, but I think that in terms of within the what I would call the perspectival order, or what Lacan calls the symbolic order, what this actually functioned to do was sort of give everyone relief from their cognitive dissonance of the fact that, our leaders really are pedophiles. But if Ricky Gervais can go at the Golden Globe speech and tell it to their face, then I can feel better about it. And I sort of see a parallel to this with Zizek's understanding of absolute knowing. It's not aphesis. It's not release from bondage. It's not. That's the definition.
It's kind of like just like it almost seems very ironic. It's just sort of bathing in all the ironies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think now we can kind of move on to, or I guess one thing I want to say before we move on is how, reading this and reading your critique of this subjectivity, or this idea of subjectivity, it really shows that, when you read these, let's say these post-enlightenment or these enlightenment continental thinkers who, talk about the talk about the subject. People like Hegel or Fichte or Schelling, whoever it may be, Descartes even. What they're writing about, they're not completely wrong. It's not like what they have to say or to write about is completely out of whack. We just need to discard it whatsoever. It really shows that what they're getting at, though, is not what the subject, ought to be. The subject, in Christ or, Jesus and what the church teaches about the person. Rather, they talk about and they describe with some fairly accurate notions of what the fallen subject is. And so that's what I really like about especially the work you do on your YouTube channel with your series like Baptizing Philosophy, some of your other videos. You show how we don't have to completely 100% disregard these more quote unquote secular philosophies, but we can show how what they're getting at something very real, but we can also critique them and go beyond it while taking those insights for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that is my approach to philosophy, or at least this type of philosophy. And even since I started that, I have now read Sergius Bulgakov and his Tragedy of Philosophy, which, according to people who have even read his other books, people in sort of our community, Tragedy of Philosophy is one of, if not his best book. And he lays out the schema for understanding philosophy as a sort of heresiology, which ultimately centers around a denial of the Trinity, in its in because for him he sort of accepts and he demonstrates how language and even metaphysics itself, the ontology of the world, testifies to the reality of the triunity. And on this basis, with this Trinitarian communal ontology and linguistics sort of as our basis, which again he argues for very convincingly, we can understand philosophy as a misunderstanding of the triunity ultimately in various ways. So just to give the example, I mean, for Bulgakov, I think I may have mentioned it earlier, but he has this subject, predicate, and copula division as the structure of language. The subject is obviously, well, let's just take the sentence, I am a man. So the I is obviously the subject, the man is predicate, and then copula is the am. And the subject is first, predicate is second, and the copula is third. Not in the sentence itself, but logically. And this is the structure of the judgment. And the judgment is the most basic sort of unit of meaning, really, because even in that statement, I am a man, it's just saying something about me at the most basic level, kind of. And the predicate is what reveals the truth of the subject, which in itself is sort of indescribable. And in this sense, we would connect the subject itself with the person, with the subject, obviously, and then the predicate with the idea, with the notion, which says stuff about the subject. And then the copula, am, in this sentence, is what unites subject and predicate together. And in the schema, just sort of stands for being, the realization of the union of subject and predicate. But that's what, like, for example, modern naturalism doesn't understand am as being. It doesn't understand existence as a union of heaven and earth, a union of subject and predicate, of self and other, and of spirit and matter, form and matter. Instead, it's this heresy, which Florensky already sort of defined as one-sidedness, the one-sidedness of rationality instead of the communality, thinking in terms of communion, mutual interiority, perichoresis, that you get in Christianity. You have a focus by philosophy on one of these three elements of being to the negation of the other. So idealism, obviously, it's philosophy of the subject. And by emphasizing the subject, you get this, always have the ever-present threat of solipsism in all its different varieties. And then there's all the impossibilities of subjectivity you get to. And then you have philosophies of the predicate of the idea, which is like, well, Hegel, he's unique amongst the... Even though, I don't know, Bulgakov's critique of Hegel isn't very good. But that's just panlogicism in general. And then you have philosophies of the copula. Actually, best example of philosophy of the idea would be Platonism and Neoplatonism. And then philosophy of the copula is philosophy just of being itself, which is Spinozian pantheism and naturalism, which ultimately are the same thing. So that schema for understanding philosophy has really helped me. And I didn't really have it when I was doing the Baptizing Philosophy podcast. So I sort of stopped that. And now we're doing Babylon is Fallen. And we're going to be talking about a lot of this stuff. We're actually having DC Schindler on the show, hopefully, in 2 weeks. We're going to cover his book next week, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. And he's sort of this Catholic Platonist scholar. Really cool guy. So we're still going to be doing this stuff, but I just wanted to mention sort of how Bulgakov's schema for understanding philosophy was so important now, just retroactively, even though I didn't have it when I was writing Aphesis.
All right, so Trey, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything? I know you talked about the Babylon is Fallen series that that you've started. Is there anything else you want to talk about on your channel that you have going on? Any projects, any links, etc., etc.?
No, not really. I mean, if you liked what you heard here, I guess you can buy Aphesis. I will say that by the end of the year, hopefully, me and Nate, who is one of the co-hosts, Nate is one of the co-hosts of Babylon is Fallen, we're writing a new book called Anagogia, Modern Philosophy Through New Eyes. The Through New Eyes part is a reference to James B. Jordan's book, Through New Eyes. So it's Anagogia will sort of see us approaching continental philosophy similar to the way I did in Aphesis, but added on is thoroughly grounding it in the biblical worldview, biblical symbolism, and biblical typology and all this stuff. So it'll be a lot better than Aphesis, which I guess isn't the best pitch for the book. But yeah, Babylon is Fallen is just the sort of main thing I'm doing right now. So we're doing it every single week, I think on Monday evenings. So if you're free on Mondays, check us out live. And but the streams will be up anyways to watch afterwards. We're really covering all the stuff that is sort of the most interesting stuff, I think, at the moment in sort of Christian Orthodox circles, like even with Peugeot and the Symbolic World guys, with John Vervaeke, and all this stuff. You can sort of see the end of naturalism and materialism coming, and logically sort of more interested in Christianity. And then the question is, what type of Christianity? And Orthodoxy sort of presents itself as, I don't know, for Americans, Orthodoxy, I think, definitely has an appeal that Catholicism and Protestantism doesn't. Aside from it, at least from my view, being the truth, it is also sort of has a uniqueness and a seriousness to it